May I have your attention, please?
Welcome to Real Gaijin, unveiling the real Japan, an American expat's inside look. Now it's time for another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts. Summarized podcast.
So welcome. I'm Mark Kennedy. I'm the host of the Real Gaijin Substack and AMA podcast. Today we have a special guest who's actually a senpai of mine on multiple levels. This is Rochelle Kopp, who is the founder and managing principal of Japan Intercultural Consulting. Rochelle, you want to say a brief hi?
Oh, hello, everyone. Thanks for
All
joining.
right, great. Good. Thank you very much. So we're going to do a deep dive into Rochelle's area of specialty, which is all about Japanese business, communication styles, and basically anything that you can think of in terms of the nuances of the cultural differences between Japan and the rest of the world. First, I want to encourage everyone who's in the podcast this morning live, please ask questions, put comments, use the chat functionality. Also, quick housekeeping update. I will be publishing this full interview in about 24 hours. So if you miss it or you want to listen to another section again, please wait for the recording to come out, but it will come out very soon. So getting back to why Rochelle is actually my senpai or senior, not that she's old or anything like that, but on multiple levels, we're from the same hometown near Chicago. And believe it or not, Rochelle is a very close friend of the older sister of one of my oldest friends from the third grade with whom I'm still in close contact. And we didn't know each other back in the day when we lived in the same town, but we've met each other once several years ago. But it's a pleasure to introduce all of you to Rochelle today. So without further ado, let's first jump into it. Rochelle, how did you become interested in Japan? And tell us a little bit more about what you've done in the meantime since arriving here for the first time.
Well, certainly. So actually, I got interested in Japan in high school back in Highland Park for several reasons. And one is that I had several friends who were Japanese American, and
Ah,
uh, we'd go to their houses. Their parents were super nice. They had lots of cool Japanese decorations, and I was really fascinated. And with that group of friends, there was a Japanese exchange student who sat with us at lunch every day for a year. Was the cousin of, if you know, Lisa Meshi, was her cousin came over from Japan and lived with her for a year and went to our high school. And the cousin, whose name I'm not remembering, was very interesting. And so every day she had some cool Japanese thing, even like a Japanese book she was reading. It opens the opposite side, the characters go the other way. She always had some interesting thing or some interesting thing to say. So she was kind of fascinating. And my hobby was doing artwork, and I was really interested in Japanese art and took classes at actually one of our high school teachers. Gita Hardiman had opened a studio behind her house and invited her favorite students to come take classes there. And there was a Japanese woman who was an artist who used the space also, named Yumiko, and she was this fascinating person. And so I had all these exposures to Japanese people, and they were so interesting, and I was so fascinated by the art. Obviously, the Art Institute of Chicago has a wonderful ukiyo-e collection, one of the best in the world. And Highland Park is near the Botanic Garden, and they would have Ikebana exhibits periodically. And so I got these exposures to things that were Japanese, and I thought, well, Japan's just really cool. And when I went to college, I realized I wanted to have a career in business. And this is at a time when Japanese companies were, really flooding the US market with imports. And I thought, well, if I learn Japanese, it'll be useful for business. I can use it for a career, and it'll be really interesting from the culture side, kind of kill two birds with one stone. So that was my idea.
I got it. I got it. Yeah. Well, back at the time, of course, when you talk about when we were in high school and then in college, Japan was on top of the world.
Right,
And
exactly.
that was actually one of the reasons why I started studying Japanese in college too. Fascinating. And then, so you went to Yale, I understand, for
Right, that's correct. Yeah.
2 years. Did you have a chance to come to Japan as an exchange student?
I wasn't an exchange student. It was actually through a business-related exchange called ISEC. And
Ah,
so I was part of the ISEC club at Yale. And the way ISEC works is that there are branches at universities around the world.
mhm.
Each branch tries to set up internships for foreign students at companies near their school. And the number of internships you set up, that's the number of your students that get to go someplace else on an internship.
Oh,
So I
that's a good
was
idea.
part of that group, and I went to Japan as for my internship. So it was the summer between junior and senior year. I was at a Shinyo Kinko, which is like a savings and loan in Kyoto.
Oh, wow. Okay. Right.
Which
Fantastic.
was really fun because they would, take us to visit their customers, and their customers were the doll maker, like the kimono maker and
Ah,
Kiyomizudera, so,
okay.
so I really like got steeped in Kyoto culture for a summer. It was great.
And so I imagine that this must have been like the impetus behind ultimately the idea to open your own consulting firm.
Well, exactly. Well, that was very interesting from a business culture side. And at Yale, I was a history major, but I took a lot of sort of things that were going to be pre-businessy, including organization behavior. And so then I was going to Japan and taking what I learned about organization behavior and in this Japanese company. I'm like, this things work really differently. I had my summer jobs in college were working at a large company that my father worked at, and I had a summer job, you basically lots of people's kids went and I was doing administrative assistant work basically. And so I had some experience of what a US workplace was like. And so then contrasting that with what I was seeing in Japan, automatically, millions of things to think about. And then after college, I went back to Chicago and I worked for a consulting firm there for a couple of years. And then I came back to Tokyo and I had a job at a large Japanese bank. And
Right. Okay.
they were rapidly expanding. They were a trust bank, and they had been a very domestically focused organization. And then, because of the things what were going on with the economies at the time and their particular positioning, they were making tons and tons of money. They were very profitable, and they were like, "Let's go global." And they had set up offices all over the world and hiring bankers all over the world who then were coming into this very traditional Japanese
Mm,
organization and with where there wasn't a lot of communication, and the non-Japanese employees were like, "What's going on?" And they were hiring people like me at the headquarters who were not from Japan, and it was kind of like a little mini United Nations. And so there were a few people
fascinating.
from the US, and there was someone from the UK, and someone from Canada, and someone from Singapore, and someone from Malaysia, and someone from Korea, and someone from France. That kind of like a little sprinkling of all different places.
Oh,
And it was their little portfolio of non-Japanese employees. And so we were all like trying to figure out, well, what's going on here. So I got really interested in how can Japanese organizations incorporate non-Japanese employees, both within Japan and globally, because that you need to do that in order to expand as a global company. And there's a lot of challenges behind that culturally and organizationally. And so I got really interested in that issue. And then that's what I started to focus on for my consulting work. After working in Japan, I went back to the US. While getting my MBA, I started to do research on Japanese multinationals and their HR and cultural issues. And on the basis of that, wrote a book in Japanese and a book in English. I worked for another consulting firm for a little while to learn a few more tools of the trade, and then I went out on my own, focusing specifically on Japanese companies and then also on companies from around the world that are working either in Japan or with
ah,
Japanese firms.
vice versa. Okay,
Yeah,
got
so I
it.
did the other direction too. Yeah.
And so go before we jump forward into your current business, back though in those early days, particularly in Kyoto, which has its own unique business culture, what were some of the examples of business practices that struck you as really unusual or different from the Western background?
So I think the biggest I guess surprises were when I was working at the bank, Yasuda Trust, and then I was really trying to get work done. And the thing that was what really I was having trouble understanding was this idea of nemawashi.
Ah,
And if I wanted to get something done, that I had to go around and talk to lots of people and somehow gain consensus. I'm like, well, how do I know who I'm supposed to talk to? And what am I supposed to say to them? I'm like, well, there's no guidebook for this. And so I was really
Hmm.
interested in, how do I figure that out?
And so also, what about the fact that you're a woman? I mean,
You
how
know,
was that received back then?
that was not so much of an issue. So at the time, they were just starting to have women on career track positions. So there
Oh,
were some Japanese women on career track positions also.
hmm,
And so I was kind of, I was the career track also. So I was kind of similar to them. I really felt um, that really any challenges or things that were hard for me were not because I was a woman, but because I was not Japanese. And that seemed to
yeah,
be much more important than my gender. I do have one sort of funny story that comes up though, that um, there was an American woman in the HR department named Karen, and she was complaining to me that like every night, like a different department of the company um, was, like, inviting her out to, like, to drink. And this was when there was, the evening socializing was, like, every single night at that time. It's waned in the interviewing years. And I was like, "Well, that's strange. No one's really asking me to do that." And, I had just as an aside, earlier in my career at the bank, when I had worked in the US before coming to Japan, I was working at a startup. It had long hours, and I just, like, stayed there till 7 o'clock at night every night. Was just, like, that was normal working for me. So in Japan, I was doing the same thing, and there were other people staying late, and I had plenty to do, and just staying late was really normal based on my other work experience. Well, my boss one day came up to me, and he had looked up the word in English. "I want you to go home promptly." And he had spent the like 4 years prior running the bank's Sao Paulo representative office. And he had kind of really gotten into Brazilian culture and kind of hadn't completely adjusted back to the US. So his name was Mr. Nakajima and his nickname was Samba Nakajima.
oh,
'Cause he was just like I think he was just like an enthusiastic, outgoing person to start with, and so, like, that just blossomed in Brazil, and he was never able to, like, put it back into the box after coming back, but so he was like and he's like he told me, like, "I'm used to going home at a regular hour, and if you stay late, I have to stay late." So, I'm like, "Okay, I'll go home on time every day," and I'd set up a schedule where I went to, flower arranging class twice a week. I went to calligraphy class once a week, and I went to Japanese class once a week. So 4 days a week, I was out doing stuff, Monday through Thursday. And so I've had evening plans. So so going back to my colleague Karen, who was going out to eat all the time and be invited to every nomikai from every department. And I'm like, well, what could be the difference? She's blonde haired and blue eyed.
ah,
She liked to wear kind of short skirts, and she had really good legs, and I'm
ah,
like, "Well," and I dressed
mm,
slightly more conservatively than that, and I'm like, "Well, could that be it? Because actually, if you had interacted with us, our personalities were fairly similar, and if you interacted in English." But she had, studied for a year at ICU in college,
mm,
and her part-time job was, hostess at a sushi bar. And so she
ah,
spoke sushi barmaid Japanese. And so her Japanese was, like, kind of casual and slangy, and some people thought that was, like, adorable, and some
mm,
people were horrified by it. Meanwhile, like, I had only ever studied Japanese, like, in school, but then I done a business internship, so, like, my Japanese is super polite. And there were people who liked Karen because they thought she was just so, like, a card and, like, funny, and, like, people who were, like, Rochelle fans because like, I was more proper, and, like, if you talk to us in English, we were actually not that different in our personality, but we came across really differently in Japanese. And I thought, "Well, maybe it's that." I couldn't figure out what it was. Well, one day I was coming up back from some errand or whatever, and, we're sitting it's a Japanese office, it's open desks. My boss is sitting right there, Nakajima-san. He's on the phone. He's like, "No, no." He hadn't noticed I was there. It's like coming from an angle, he couldn't see me. He's saying to someone, "No, no, no. Rochelle is a serious person. And every day after work, she goes and she is studying. She is not going to your nomikai. He had been like, everyone had been asking me, and he's telling me, I'm telling them no on my behalf.
He's playing interference for you, Samba.
Yes, he was running interference for me, and he had a couple daughters, so I think I was like daughter
Ah,
number 3 in his mind, and I was not going to be going out to everyone's nomikai because I was a serious person and I was studying every night.
okay. Whoa. All right. That is fascinating. Well, I could take it that you're still a serious person. And speaking of that, then, so uh, you decided to, after all these experiences, and by the way, you've been back and forth now on 4 separate stints
This is
back to
my
Chicago.
fourth stint now. Yes, so I had the time I was here in college. At the time I was working at Yasuda Trust that I just mentioned with Mr. Nakajima. Then I went back, and I started my company in the US.
Oh,
Um, and so was working in the US. We started a Japan branch in 1999. And
ah,
2000, about 2005, it was growing really quickly. And I came and to Japan and lived again for a year, supporting, their growing. So
ah,
it's from 2005 2006, I was here again. Then went back and then came back in 2019. I had a chance to help a Japanese university start its global business program.
okay.
And so I came here, was here for that. I got stuck in Japan during the coronavirus. But also while I was here, there's plenty to do with my Japan branch here and them having me here, like, oh, Rochelle, come do this, come do that. And clients were happy. And then also, opportunity I got from living in Japan was to be on the board of a Japanese public company. And now I'm on 2 Japanese public company
Mm,
boards. And they meet every month. And so
oh,
it really makes much more sense to just to be in Japan. And so I'm
yeah,
I'm I'm here again now living while I'm doing that.
I got it. By the way, just listening to you, I know we prepared a little bit in advance, but just listening about this, I'm thinking about big news of the acquisition of U.S. Steel.
Mhm.
Mm. I can imagine you must have some thoughts on that because I just can't even imagine a more extreme case of one culture interacting with another one and then not likely to work out all that well, particularly with this golden ticket or, the golden
Oh,
share
this golden
owned
thing with
by
the
the
US
government.
government, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's an interesting twist to it. Well, it was certainly a fascinating watching the whole thing play out.
Mm,
And US Steel, and I'm forgetting the name of the leader, but their lead not US Steel, I'm sorry, Nippon Steel. Their leader, and I'm forgetting his name, was dead set on making this happen. And it was with all the headwinds in the US politically, it's the sort of thing that most people would have just given up.
mm,
And he was like, "No, we're gonna make this happen." So his determination was really quite impressive and ultimately succeeded. So I feel like one thing that I often really admire about a lot of Japanese companies is that they don't give up on things, that
mm.
they decide they're gonna do something and then they, like, really get committed to it, and this is a great example of, an organization that said, well, particularly this one leader said, "We're gonna make this happen." So, you know, there was a real determination at Nippon Steel that this was important and they wanted to make it succeed. And from everything
Mm.
I've heard, they're carrying that into, how they're working with the acquisition. And, if you've got a determination to make something succeed, then you're going to do everything that you can, right?
True,
So they're
true.
going to need to prove they're going to need to be very careful about the culture things because you're right, it's going to be very different.
So I could imagine that if there were ever a star client that you would want, it would probably be Nippon Steel. I mean, they could probably make a lot of headway with your consulting expertise. What kind of issues do you expect them to have to deal with, and maybe not have to deal with all that smoothly?
Well, I would say probably they're going to have, from what I understand, they're going to be offering a lot of technical support to the US
Mhm.
side. And if it's technical support, that means that they're probably going to be having a lot of their technical team from Japan interacting closely with the US side. And so I've done a lot of work, for example, with Japanese companies in the auto parts area
Oh,
who
okay.
are who have opened plants in the United States.
Hmm.
So think like half an hour or 45 minutes outside Indianapolis, or half an
Sure.
hour
Okay.
or 2 hours outside Columbus or Lexington. So in rural areas of the US Midwest are dotted with factories that make parts for the Japanese automakers that have factories in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, etc., right? And so there's these scatterings of parts makers, and they're in rural areas of the United States, and they're bringing their Japanese best technical talent to come to help set up these operations and run these operations. So I've done a lot of work with Japanese engineers or technical people who are coming into these very US environments,
Hmm.
working with American colleagues who might never have met anyone from Asia
Ah,
and
okay.
don't have, because you're in rural Ohio, you wouldn't have a chance to meet someone from
It's
Asia,
true.
right?
Hmm.
And so then that requires a lot of you know cultural intelligence to be successful in that situation.
What
Uh,
are some
yeah.
examples of the challenges that the incoming engineers would face in the United States?
Well, I think one just basic one is often their English is not
Ah,
fluent, right?
all right.
And so then that's just a basic difficulty, right? And but then not knowing, okay, what do I talk to people about? How do I become comfortable or friendly with people, especially if I'm not like completely understanding what they're saying? How do I
Mm,
break down those barriers to feel like a team with the local colleagues?
mm, okay. And
And
then
then,
how about,
yeah,
I'm sorry, from the opposite point of view, do you also give advice to the local people, like in this case in the United States, about how
right.
they can better interact with their Japanese colleagues?
Exactly. Because I really, with the cultural training that I do, it needs to go from both sides. Both sides need to be learning and understanding and be open and make effort.
And what kind of misunderstandings do you see most commonly?
Well, a lot of things are miscommunications.
Mhm.
Of course, the language barrier sets you up for that, but even things like a Japanese person will say, no, I think that's going to be difficult. And often someone from the US will hear it and say, oh, I've been given a challenge. It's difficult. I better try harder and spend more time and effort on it. The Japanese person's like, why? I was trying to tell you not to do it. And, it's completely not connecting. So a lot of things like that can happen, right?
And what kind of advice do you provide? I mean, without giving away paid advice, but
Right.
to help ameliorate that kind of situation from both sides.
Well, I think, first of all, both sides need to understand, well, why is that happening? That the American person's taking what's being said literally.
Mm.
For a Japanese person used to communicating in that oblique way, and for having people to be um, reading between the lines.
Ah,
And so, first of all, to realize, okay, that's not going to work, that I need to be more clear. I need to be more detailed
ah.
when I'm communicating, saying things that I wouldn't need to say in Japan, more of the background, more of the context, more directly, here's what I want you to do. And so, just knowing that you need to do that. And meanwhile, from the US side, to realize, hey, you might not be getting the whole message. If you're not sure what someone's trying to tell you, don't just assume, ask follow-up questions to try and get more information out. I feel like one of the biggest problems happen is when you make assumptions.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes sense. How about, for example, I know a lot of work that you do has to do with HR. The whole concept of pay for performance versus more of a Japanese style of HR management. How is that viewed from both perspectives?
Right. And so I think that is a very, very big difference in the compensation systems that are typical. And in Japan, some companies in recent years have been adopting some pay per performance, but the
Oh,
amount by which your salary might change based on performance is much smaller. So
yeah,
just a little bit extra, whereas in the US it can be fairly extreme.
sure, sure.
Right.
And
And
then,
yeah.
mhm.
And there was actually even to show a kind of an extreme case that happened recently in Japan. Did you hear about the Prudential Insurance scandal?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, I'm a client to them.
Oh my
So,
goodness. Oh boy. Well, I hope you weren't subjected to the
no,
problems.
no, no. I wasn't the victim of what happened, but the salesperson that's assigned to my account has contacted me multiple times by phone and written correspondence to
Mhm.
apologize.
Of course, yeah, I can imagine. And I was looking into the coverage of why that happened, and what they say the key cause is that evidently the Prudential salespeople were on 100% commission um,
Mhm.
compensation system, which is the extreme of pay per performance, right? But this was unstable. It's very unstable, and it kind of encouraged people to start doing all these things that weren't ethical. So it's sort of an interesting example of how that compensation style maybe doesn't work in a Japanese context because it doesn't
I
have the
see.
stability that people are looking for.
Got it. And getting back to the experience of consulting for automobile parts manufacturers that send engineers or technical experts to America, in this case, is the goal essentially to communicate that and train that expertise so that local people then can take over and then a Japanese expert can return to Japan or go to the next country?
That is the goal. But what's interesting is in a lot of cases it doesn't work. And I've done work helping companies to try and address that. Because a lot of times what will happen is there's this general idea of, oh, this engineer is going to come over and train Americans. But then if the engineer doesn't really get any guidance on how to train the Americans
Mm,
and doesn't speak English very well, and the Americans aren't sure how to deal with a Japanese person. Also, if you have too much turnover on the US side, you don't have a stable group to um to transfer to. And that's a whole other issue because if again with compensation and other things, if you're not employing people and paying them and treating them the way they want to be treated, they're going to leave. And there's lots of opportunities if you're a good employee. And so some of these operations that have a lot of turnover. And so that's one of the other things I often work with companies on is, why are people leaving? What can we do about it? But I do see a lot of situations where the either because you don't have a stable group of people to transfer to, or the people who are sent over maybe weren't told specifically you have to do this, or
mm.
here it wasn't structured enough. And so then what happens is there's problems, and then the Japanese person's like, well, it's just easy to fix it myself.
Ah,
Doesn't really train the local people. Then the head office will just automatically send someone else, and then you've never transferred your technology. So I have one client that had this happen, and they had huge number of Japanese who had been sent over, and their operation in the US was completely reliant on these Japanese engineers. And that was not sustainable. Also, the cost of having one expatriate in the US is huge, and it was taking up a lot of their engineering talent, and their firm needed to do stuff in other places. So I worked with them, and it was a multi-layered plan to try and figure out, okay, how can we get this technology transferred and decrease the number of expatriates? And part of it was having a very clear goal for each expatriate at the beginning of their assignment. Here is what you have to teach people, and
ah,
they need to know how to do it before you leave. So you have
got it.
X years, and here's what you have to accomplish. And it was made very, very clear to the people. I did training for the Japanese on how to be working effectively with American colleagues and how to do some of this technology transfer and how to be teaching effectively to Americans, which usually requires a lot more verbal coaching than Japanese would be used to. In Japan, there's a lot of, it's called Minarai.
Mm.
So watch me and learn
Yeah.
and shadow me, and
Yeah.
maybe doesn't have as much explanation, but that doesn't really work in a US context where people need things to be more verbal. They need a chance to try something and then be coached on it. So to learning some of those techniques. And then we also did training for the Americans on, how to be learning from Japanese more effectively. So
Mm.
they did their part and they took their number of expatriates down 60%.
Oh, okay. So that's a clear metric. Very good success
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
See, before we get into the next question, I wanted to just encourage the number of people that we have quite a few who are listening in. So thank you for joining us. Please ask anything of Rochelle. This is an Ask Me Anything session, AMA. You can use the chat functionality down at the bottom of the screen or on the side of the screen to put in your question and or comment, and I'll read it. And you can ask for a friend. We won't necessarily identify you if you don't want to be identified. So ask anything. Rochelle, I'm curious. It sounds like a lot of your expertise has been back and forth between American culture and Japanese culture, especially as it relates to automobile manufacturers. Now, after entering the Chinese market, a lot of Japanese firms are starting to shift gears, so to speak, to move to India,
Mm-hmm.
another English-speaking country. Well, in theory, not everyone speaks English there, of course.
Right.
Is your consultancy focused more on Japanese American issues, or is it global at this point?
We are global. And so, in
Ah,
fact, we just opened our branch in India 2 years ago.
oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. And
Um,
so, and one of the reasons is because we do see India as a really big growing market for Japanese firms to be selling things, but also making things.
yes,
And,
exactly.
and, and so for factories, but also we have a lot of clients that make software. And of
Ah,
course, India is a really great place to do that too, right? And we also have seen some clients that are having people in India handle global shared services for back office administrative functions also.
yes, yes. Well, that's sort of what I do too. So that's great. By the way, let's not go down the rabbit hole of India because that's a whole
We
other
could talk about that
conversation.
one for 2 hours, right? Yeah,
Very good. But you did bring up software, and also I understand that you have quite a bit of experience working with clients and or other people in Silicone Valley.
right.
Can you talk a little bit about how, like, the whole Japanese approach or Japanese business culture is similar and or different from Silicon Valley? I imagine it's quite different.
Well, it's different and it's also similar. So, um, you know, Silicon Valley is famous for the sort of fail fast
Mm,
and try things, learn from mistakes, iteration, be agile.
yeah.
So on one hand, Japanese companies hate making mistakes. And so, it's hard to sort of do that. Oh, let's just try it and see how it goes.
Mm,
Doesn't really work in Japan. But the idea of doing an iteration and
mm,
trying something and learning from it and refining
mm.
is a very Japanese idea.
Yes.
And some of the people who created, like, for example, some of the agile software processes, etc., there were some inspirations from Kaizen and Japanese approaches. What I always liken it to is, Japanese like to use this PDCA, the plan, do, check, act cycle.
Mm.
And I think that the way that they do it in Silicon Valley is they're doing that cycle also, but the plan part is extremely abbreviated. And so you
Ah,
get to do very quickly.
ah.
But other than that, the concept is very similar.
So when you provide this cross-cultural education for both sides, in this case, as it applies to Silicon Valley, does it instead of the auto manufacturers in Indianapolis, what's different? What do you have to coach differently?
Well, I feel like when I'm working with Silicon Valley firms, a lot of the communication issues, like, oh, that's going to be difficult, is really a hint that it's no, those issues are still there. But I find with Silicon Valley companies, then it's more about decision-making agility. And
Ah,
and Silicon Valley companies are all about doing things quickly and seizing the market opportunity. And acting quickly is not something that Japanese firms are particularly strong at. And so, but the problem is that if you don't work with the procedures or ways that Japanese companies do things, then it can take even longer.
hmm,
So you have to learn how to work with the system or else it actually will make things worse.
I see. Say, another person that I recently interviewed on this podcast series has written extensively on LinkedIn and other sources and written a book. One common theme that seems to make a lot of sense is that when a foreign company is trying to sell to a Japanese client, they, especially if it's a complicated product or an enterprise type of client, they have to make sure that they get buy-in not just from the top C-suite executives, but most importantly from the gemba, the front
Yeah.
line. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I think that's really key. To get a Japanese organization comfortable with doing something new, it can't be just imposed from the top. That the people who are actually going to be working with it or using it need to be involved and that they need to be convinced. And so I think a lot of times for American organizations, well, I'm just going to find that high level one decision maker who's going to decide something. But a Japanese organization, you have to find a way to get to those Gemba people and
Mhm.
have them see what you're doing and have them be comfortable and have them then tell their upper level people, yeah, we can do this or we're all right with it.
I see. Yeah, that makes well, that's very consistent advice from what we heard from this
Yeah.
other interviewee. I see. And then, so, okay, maybe we can go back to the India office. As
Okay.
you see Japanese firms expanding even more globally than before, and particularly as they pivot toward Southeast Asia and now South Asia,
Yeah.
India in particular, what are some of the big differences that you have to consult on as it relates to cultural expectations?
Well, the interesting thing, I'll talk about Southeast Asia first because there are so many Japanese companies doing things in Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc., Thailand, Philippines. So we have a lot of clients that are doing a lot in those areas. And I was talking earlier with the difficult example. And so we often work with scales in our work. If we look at a scale about indirect versus direct, we we might have pretty direct cultures like the U.S. We have even more direct cultures like Germany or Netherlands or Russia, which are much more direct. Then we have Japan, which is less direct. But then even less direct than Japan would be those Southeast Asian cultures.
Oh,
So
hmm,
and so that's an adjustment that Japanese have to make because if they're working with Americans or Europeans, they need to kind of be more direct. On the other hand, if they're working with people in Southeast Asia, those people are going to be less direct. And
hmm,
so Japanese would need to use different techniques to be bridging those. And I feel like sometimes in Japan, it's like, oh, it's us Japanese versus foreigners. And they put everyone who's not Japanese into one bucket. But actually, there's a huge diversity among different cultures. And if you go into um, Vietnam and you start telling people what to do, like really directly,
hmm,
like, yeah, on the surface that they may go along with you, but they won't have a buy in and it won't go well. And so I do see Japanese sometimes falling into that. The other thing that happens in these manufacturing situations is actually we see the exact same problem in Mexico, which is also an indirect culture, is that in Japan, people are less direct, but if it's a hierarchical relationship, so like a
hmm,
boss and their employee, they might be really, really direct.
mm.
And so a boss might like chew out their employee or like even yell at them. And in a very indirect culture like Southeast Asia or Mexico, that would be totally taboo.
Oh, huh.
So let me tell you a
Even in
story that
Thailand.
I heard recently
Huh.
from someone who had been working for a Japanese company's US operation. And that US operation also oversaw the factory in Mexico. And so one time, the Japanese expatriate who was running the US operation went down to the Mexico factory. He was very unhappy with something that had been going on there. And in front of the entire workforce, he kind of severely berated the Mexican factory manager.
Ooh.
The next day, half the employees did not show up for work. They just
Oh,
and they never came back because
oh, whoa.
in Mexican culture that would be such a inappropriate thing to do. They're like, I don't want to be in a place where people get treated like that or where my like boss that I respected is treated badly. They're like, I'm out of here. And in an indirect culture, people just take themselves out of the situation.
I wouldn't have expected a Japanese manager to actually do that,
But
but
when there's a hierarchical difference, they do that, and it's particularly strong in
uh,
in the manufacturing environments. So Ichiro Honda, the founder of Honda, was famous for walking through the factory and hitting people. He saw someone on the production line didn't like what they're doing, bam, smacked him on the shoulder, and it was a
oh,
perverse badge of honor in Honda. Oh, Honda-san hit me.
I
But
got
that's
it.
just
I
like one
got it.
example. Is fairly common in manufacturing environments to have that kind of pretty strong top down.
Interesting. So is that like the equivalent of a Japanese baseball team where
It's the same. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And so they'll say in Japanese business they'll call it taikuke. So like a sports team.
yeah,
My person, and there's lots of issues with Japanese school sports, and sometimes that yelling at kids gets into like hitting and corporal punishment, and there's been a lot of issues and
yeah,
problems with pretty severe kind of bullying type situations by sports coaches in Japan. Actually, one of our team members wrote a whole book on it. It was part of his PhD dissertation. Um, so it's a big issue. But what I see that spills into the workplace because that's the image that people have of this is how you lead. And so
mhm,
we actually had a couple years ago. Sometimes companies ask us to help with their new employee training, the Shinyu Sharin Kenshu, and we were doing a global training. And it was actually, we were trying to look at various different cultures. And we actually had a case study that was related to what I was just talking about with an employee from Vietnam who was really harshly berated by their Japanese boss and like took it like much more strongly than we would think, for example, like an American would, and was like, and confiding to a Japanese coworker, oh, maybe I should quit because they'd gotten yelled at once, which would be typical for someone from Vietnam because that's just so extreme from their cultural view. So we actually had a case study that was kind of about this as a way to bring up some of the differences in styles. And we had it was part of like a bunch of different case studies and a bunch of things, but um we were having the employees and there was like 250 of them because it was the entering class for a company. And so I had a bunch of my team members and um the groups were all discussing at small tables these case studies, and my team members were fanning out and kind of monitoring and et cetera. And so what afterwards one of my team members told me that one of the tables there was one of the employees was fiercely defending the Japanese boss who had yelled at the Vietnamese employee. And well, that's just okay to do that. And everyone else at the table was like, what? My team member was like listening to this whole thing. And he's like, yeah, well, I played baseball in
yeah.
high school and college, and that's how my coach was, and that's just how you manage people. You gotta yell at people sometime. And so this was like he was starting, his new job as a fresh college graduate, and already had this idea that that was okay and that was good.
Oh,
And that was just a couple years ago. So I feel like this kind of we think of it as a very old school type of style,
yeah.
but people are still conditioned to it based on those sports experiences.
So, for example, I can imagine, I remember I used to work with one person who was used to work for me as a sales manager. He would not use like san or any yobi state. So, in other words, just call them by their last name and in front of everyone.
Mm,
which struck some other associates as not being appropriate. And
right, exactly. But that wouldn't
mm,
be an example of that. Yeah. It's kind
mm,
of
okay,
demeaning or belittling to do that, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
right,
But again, traditionally that was accepted if there was a hierarchical difference.
yeah. Well, this particular person was into judo and had played I mean, almost made it to the Olympics. So yeah,
Wow.
it was. Aha. Okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense now. Say, speaking of Shinyushain or new recruits or new employees, what kind of changes do you see as it relates to the generations in Japan? So the generation Z or Z in
Mm.
Japanese. Are you seeing anything that's different? Other,
I think
if
there's
especially if they haven't been in the sports team like that.
right, exactly. No, I do think there are differences. And, in surveys and also behavior that we see says that younger Japanese are not as wedded to the idea of working for the same company for their entire career.
Mm,
And
yes.
so we see more people leaving firms if they don't like it. Sometimes pretty quickly within the first couple years. Like, I don't like it, I'm going to leave. And that's of course very different than traditionally what you had seen. So
Okay. And I imagine also that since there's so many people that are gig workers, essentially working part time, not as full time associates, how they're treated within a company might be different too.
right, exactly, yeah. And well,
Okay.
that's a whole issue I think in Japan, of people who don't become regular employees and don't get that formal new employee training, and they're only doing gig work and just never get properly trained or never
Yeah.
get onto a path to move up. And so that's a big issue, I feel.
Mm, yes.
A lot of Japanese companies use contract workers as a way to avoid, there's a heavy commitment in Japan when you hire people for as a full-time employee, as a seishain, a regular employee. So they'll have a lot of people as contract employees because those contract employees can be let go if needed. And it gives you flexibility and it limits the number of people that you're making the sort of heavy seishain promise to. But then those people who are contract employees never have stability.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and then they don't always get properly trained. So I feel like it's a big human capital issue in Japan.
Got it. So, thinking back, since you've had such a long career in both cultures, in particular now advancing globally, what other things might have changed over the past 30 years as it relates to intercultural challenges? And before you answer that, I just want to make a quick shout out to all of the people that are joining us online. Please use that chat functionality to ask Rochelle a question and we'll read it out.
Okay.
So,
Uh,
what has changed a
okay,
little bit?
well,
Mhm.
what I've seen changed is, my first book in English was The Rice Paper Ceiling: Breaking Through Japanese Corporate Culture. And now there are lots of people who are tearing up that rice paper ceiling, and people who are
Ah,
non-Japanese advancing to higher positions in Japanese organizations.
yeah,
So either as board members, like I'm doing. So when I wrote that book, I never could have imagined I would be on the board of a Japanese
yeah,
company, right? So board members, but in senior positions in Japan or in senior positions running the U.S. operations for a Japanese firm.
mm,
Or in just in
true.
higher level things. Also, uh, non-Japanese executives in those foreign operations being put on the board of their Japanese parent company.
I see.
They're
So,
getting
does
a role there. Mhm.
your firm provides like executive coaching
We,
for
we do
such
provide a
people?
lot of executive coaching. We do work with a lot of people like that. So I think the way I wanted to answer your question was that now more non-Japanese are at higher positions in Japanese firms, which
Mm,
means you have to interact with the system at an even higher and more sophisticated level.
that's right.
Right. And so like that, like doing nemawashi, that's just like the basic. It's it goes from there. And so I feel like the the amount of knowledge and sort of savvy that you need goes up when your position goes up as well.
I see. Now, I can imagine this might be dependent upon the person, but in for foreigners working in Japan in such elevated positions at Japanese companies, are some of them starting to take Western ideals and ways of managing a company and introducing that to the Japanese firm?
Well, that's really interesting because a lot of times Japanese companies will purposefully put non-Japanese in higher positions with the expectation that they'll help shake things up a little bit. But again, if
Mhm.
you shake things up too much, then you're going to upset the balance. So you
Mm.
have to do that carefully. But I think there is an expectation, hey, you've got some different experiences and skills that you can use to help us maybe improve or refine the way that we do things. So yeah, I do think that that is an expectation often.
Interesting. Yeah, one thing, so I used to manage I founded and then managed the US subsidiary of American medical device manufacturer where I worked for a long time.
Hmm.
And on I guess it was the second tour of duty being sent back to Japan. On the very first day, literally like 12 hours after I arrived, I met my whole team. And one of the manager's first question out of the gate was, when are you going back? So, way to break the ice. But
Wow. Hope you
it
didn't
turned out
wait
to
too long. How long
Yeah,
do you have to
right.
deal with
I've
you?
been waiting out. All right. Yeah, well, it worked out great, and this person went on to be very successful even under me, but it was quite a
Oh my
interesting way to
goodness.
start things off.
Wow.
Going back, though, to, India, I have heard that, there are also a lot of Korean companies that are entering the Indian market and setting up manufacturing organizations, but, a lot of those managers that are sent are told, "You can't come back to Korea until your local entity in Korea and India becomes profitable."
Oh
So
wow.
it takes as long as it takes, whereas the Japanese managers that are sent over to India from Japan typically only are there for 3 years.
Right.
And
Part of the normal
Indian
rotation system. Yeah.
Yes, and Indian employees or associates know this. So they figure in some cases I've heard that they'll just wait it out until
Well,
so and
that
so
that
goes
could
back.
happen. Well, there's all sorts of issues with that. You have that, well, I'll just wait till that person leaves. But then I also see on the other hand, um, Japanese managers there for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, goes back. Person who succeeds them, like, has to start from 0, and the
Yeah,
local team has to train them up. Or the other thing that happens is this person had philosophy A, they go home, the new person comes, they have philosophy B, and then the local employees get total whiplash, and there's no
yes.
continuity. So there's so many issues with
Mm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that opens up many opportunities for your firm.
Well, this is true, but it's just a challenge. So I think that whole let's move people around periodically. I mean, there's a lot of reasons Japanese companies do that, and there's a lot of good reasons, but often they do it kind of randomly and without thinking about those other effects.
Yes. Okay, good. Say in that we've kind of gone over our general agenda pretty thorough here. In the few minutes we have left, I wanted to ask you about AI since it's absolutely everywhere now
Right.
and you can't go anywhere without talking about it. How do you expect AI to change some of the cultural differences that you're consulting on, as
Well, I
particularly as a Japanese firm?
I think the first thing is that AI is really helpful for addressing the language barrier.
Mm,
And it's helpful in 2 ways. It's great for translating things quickly and accurately. It's not perfect and you have to be really careful. I find that it's like 90 to 95% right, but often the
yeah.
things it gets wrong are really key and it can be a really problem. So it's very easy you can get lulled into trusting it and then it's not translating properly. So you have to be careful, but it is just really helpful for those everyday conversations, for creating a transcript of a meeting that you can then go back and
Mm,
read through and check. So if the meeting is not in your native language, then you can review, or even sometimes it'll have the, real time it'll be having it.
yeah.
Also, AI is great for language training.
Yes.
That
Yes.
you can set up ChatGPT to be your language tutor or your language conversation partner, and there's lots of also products for language learning that are powered by AI.
Mhm.
So I feel like helping the language barrier is going to be useful. Um, so I think that's a really big impact of AI. The other thing about AI that's interesting is that Japanese usage of it seems to be lagging behind many
Mm.
other countries.
Mhm.
And if you look at, sort of statistics on how many people have tried ChatGPT, for example, Japan's pretty low. And this I feel like goes hand in hand with there's much lower computer literacy in Japan than in many other countries.
Yes, I agree.
And there's a lot of statistics on that. And so I feel like, Japan's trying to do digital transformation and things like that. There's just a lot of people who just don't have the skills.
How about the whole well, I know the Japanese like to call ChatGPT Chappy right now, and, one thing I've noticed, even in my own house, my wife is Japanese, she hasn't trained Chappy to be a little bit more direct, so, in other words, she appreciates when it's very polite and say, in other words, it's so affirmative that it's almost, like, obsequious, and I could just see how that could cause all sorts of issues and misunderstandings in Japanese culture.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, because that it is something that it does, and it's on one hand it's nice, and it's sort of like, okay, come on, stop like kissing up to me so much. It's sort of annoying,
Yeah,
but yeah,
right.
I could see in Japan that like that might be interpreted even differently or
Mm,
more. It could be more problematic. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
Alright, well, we'll see. Um, hey, we are at the end of our hour. It went very fast, so thank you so much
Lots of
for
fun
joining,
talking with
and
you. As you can tell, I
yeah,
love talking about this stuff. So
yeah, well, plus you've got such a depth of knowledge here over 4 decades, essentially, of being involved with Japan. I was just calculating, I graduated from high school, I think, when you were in college, and that's when I started studying Japanese, so this will mark the 40th year of starting to learn Japanese for me,
ah,
and yeah, and I imagine you're just a little bit further along than I am, but
mhm.
it's just amazing how, things have changed and how our lives have, and it's like we're 2 ships passing in the night here because we've had multiple stints of duty back in Chicago, where we're both from, and Tokyo, so great. Thank you for joining me, and also for everyone that's joined, thank you very much. If you want to follow up with a question for Rochelle, we have put all of her contact information in the invitation, and I'll put that in the final write-up too.
Okay,
But,
great.
if you have any burning questions, I imagine LinkedIn is also an especially good
Yeah,
spot for you
true.
to interact with people. All right, good. Rochelle, please leave us with your final comments to all of the listeners.
Boy, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope that this has been interesting. And as I've been talking about all these cultural things, it takes effort from both sides. And so I
Mm,
always suggest to people think about, okay, what can I be doing to help bridge this? And give the other person the benefit of the doubt that they're doing the best thing that they can do. And
yes.
then you'll be able both sides making efforts, you'll be able to meet halfway.
Very good advice. And it dovetails with a very nice comment that we just got online. Thanks, Rochelle. As always, great insights. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, give me 24 hours. I'll get this video out.
Okay.
And then thank you very much for joining us. And have a great day, Rochelle, and
Okay,
everyone
thanks so
who
much.
cared.
You too. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
お疲れ様でした。
Thanks for watching and or listening to another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts on Real Gaijin. Tell us what you think and be sure to tune in again next time.
Woo!